The night silence screamed, "A family's last supper." It was a warm July evening when the Thomas family gathered for what would be their last supper together, unaware that the walls that sheltered them would soon witness a horror so unspeakable it would leave an entire community shattered for years to come. In that modest suburban home on the outskirts of a quiet Midwestern town, the air hung heavy with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural, broken only by the soft clatter of cutlery and the hum of a distant TV in the living room. Richard Thomas, a father who'd spent his life building furniture for neighbors and strangers alike, sat at the head of the table, pride in his eyes as he watched his wife, Marjorie, lay out the roast chicken she'd spent all afternoon preparing. Their teenage daughter, Emily, barely 17, but brimming with quiet dreams of art school and secret love letters, flicked her eyes nervously between her parents, sensing the undercurrent of tension they always tried so hard to hide from her younger brother, Toby, who was only 10 and still believed monsters only lived under beds. But the monster was already in their home, invisible, patient, and hungry for the moment when silence would scream. Outside, the sun dipped below the horizon, washing the town in that fleeting golden hue that tricks you into believing nothing bad can happen when the world looks so beautiful. But beauty is a liar. It paints over the cracks that only reveal themselves when the lights go out. And that night, the lights did go out, literally and metaphorically. A power cut plunged the house into darkness, just as the family finished dinner. Richard grumbled about the old fuse box. Marjorie fetched candles from the kitchen drawer, and Emily sat frozen, listening to Toby giggle at the dancing shadows. Somewhere inside her a knot tightened. Something felt off, though she couldn't say what. Maybe it was the way the wind rattled the window panes. Maybe it was the way her father's voice sounded a little too forced when he assured them all it was nothing. Or maybe it was the fact that she knew her parents had been fighting again. Hushed arguments behind bedroom doors about money, about a loan they shouldn't have taken, about a brother-in-law no one ever mentioned when Toby was around. As the candles flickered, throwing monstrous shapes on the floral wallpaper, Marjorie suggested they play a board game to pass the time. It was her way of pretending things were normal, of pulling her children back into the safe little bubble she'd fought so hard to create. Emily agreed. Anything to break the tension that pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the candlelight. But Richard hesitated, staring into the darkness beyond the kitchen archway, as if he'd heard something the others hadn't. It was only for a moment, but it was enough for Emily to see the fear in his eyes, a look she'd never seen on her father's face before. They set up the game on the dining table, laughter forced between clenched teeth, dice rolling across wood older than Emily herself. Toby squealed when he won the first round, his innocence still blissfully intact. But for Marjorie and Richard, every throw of the dice seemed heavier than the last, each tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway a reminder that time was slipping through their fingers, and with it, any hope that tonight would just pass like any other. Then came the knock at the door, 3 slow, deliberate taps that echoed through the house, like a judge's gavel pronouncing a sentence no one was ready to hear. Richard froze mid-laugh, the color draining from his face. Marjorie's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Emily's breath caught in her throat, her heart drumming so loud she was sure Toby could hear it. Who knocks at a door during a blackout, when the whole neighborhood is dark, when the streets are empty and the wind is the only thing alive outside? Richard rose slowly, every muscle in his back stiff, with dread he couldn't disguise. He motioned for Marjorie to keep the kids at the table, but Emily didn't miss the subtle way her mother's fingers trembled as she pulled Toby into her lap. The front door creaked open on rusty hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. Emily strained to listen. A voice, low and unfamiliar, spoke words she couldn't make out. Then Richard's voice, softer than she'd ever heard it, pleading, almost apologetic. A silhouette crossed the doorway. A man, taller than Richard, broader in the shoulders, his face hidden in the dark. Emily felt her stomach twist when she heard her father say the word please. Richard Thomas was not a man who begged, but tonight he begged. He stepped aside, letting the stranger in. The man's boots thudded against the hallway floor, heavy, measured steps that carried him past family portraits that now looked like relics of a life already gone. He paused at the dining room entrance, his eyes sweeping the candlelit scene, Mother, daughter, son, before landing on Emily. For a heartbeat that seemed to stretch into forever, she locked eyes with him and saw nothing. No rage, no pity, no hint of humanity. Just an emptiness that sucked the air from her lungs. Richard followed close behind, voice cracking as he mumbled something about settling it tonight. No more running, no more hiding. Marjorie clutched Toby tighter, whispering a prayer she'd long abandoned. Emily's mind raced, trying to piece together scraps of overheard arguments and whispered phone calls. The loan, the brother-in-law, the money that had vanished as quickly as it came. The man sat down at the table as if he owned it. He told Richard to sit. He told Marjorie to hush. He smiled at Toby, a smile so wrong it made Emily's skin crawl. Then he began to talk, calmly, almost politely, about debts unpaid, about promises broken, about consequences. Richard tried to reason, his voice rising, trembling, then falling when the man's hand slipped into his coat and came back out holding a blade that caught the candlelight like a dying star. Emily wanted to scream, but found her voice buried somewhere deep under a mountain of terror she'd never felt before. She looked at her mother, whose eyes glistened with tears she refused to let fall. She looked at Toby, blissfully unaware, humming to himself as he traced circles on the table with his finger. She looked at her father, her strong, stubborn father, now just a man cornered by choices he couldn't undo. And in that instant, Emily understood that monsters didn't live under beds. They sat at dinner tables. They knocked when the lights went out. They made silence scream. What happened next was not a flurry of violence, but a slow, deliberate unraveling of hope. The man spoke of examples, of lessons, of the cost of betrayal. He asked Richard who he loved most at that table. He asked it twice. When no answer came, he made the choice himself. And in the flickering shadows of that candlelit room, Emily realized she would remember every detail. The smell of roast chicken turned cold, the sound of Toby's soft humming, the way her mother's nails dug into her wrist so hard she almost bled. She would remember because that's what survivors do. They carry the screams that silence can't hold. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows harder now, as if the night itself was trying to break in and save them. But no one came. Neighbors stayed asleep behind locked doors. Streetlights flickered back to life one by one, casting faint pools of light on an empty front yard that looked so normal from the outside. But inside, normal had died at the hands of a man who'd come to collect more than just a debt. He came to collect souls, to write a lesson in blood that would stain that house forever. And as the night dragged on, Emily realized that monsters don't always leave footprints. Sometimes they just leave echoes, echoes that never stop screaming, no matter how many years pass, no matter how many dawns follow a night like this. She knew the sun would rise eventually, but it would never bring warmth to that house again. And for Emily, the girl who once dreamed of art school and love letters, there would be no more dreams, only memories, and a promise she whispered to herself as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, that she would survive, even if survival meant carrying the silence that screamed louder than any voice ever could. Shadows of the aftermath, a town wrapped in fear. By the time the first sliver of dawn crept through the dusty curtains of the Thomas family's modest dining room, the world outside still had no idea that something unspeakable had ripped through the heart of their quiet neighborhood. To the mailman, who would stroll down Sycamore Lane at 7 a.m., whistling the same old tune, the Thomas house looked the same as always, paint peeling at the corners, the garden overgrown yet oddly welcoming. The American flag on the porch faded from too many summers under a harsh sun. But behind those walls, the warm hum of suburban normalcy had been gutted, replaced by the raw echo of a silence that only survivors hear, that hollow quiet that follows the shattering of everything once trusted. Emily sat curled in the corner of her bedroom, her knees drawn to her chest, her ears still ringing with the words that man had spoken after the candles sputtered out. She could still feel the damp warmth of her mother's trembling hand slipping from hers when the pleading turned into begging, and the begging turned into screams muffled by a stranger's promise to make an example out of them all. But what happens to a home that watches its own family become a lesson? It becomes a relic, an open wound that no neighbor wants to look at, but no one can turn away from. Word didn't spread at first, not in shouts or frantic calls, but in quiet, confused whispers. It was Mrs. Klein from next door who noticed first, when Toby, the boy who always left his toy trucks in her flower bed, didn't appear that morning to chase the garbage truck down the street. She tapped on the door, her knuckles echoing through a hallway still damp with dread, but there was no answer. She peered through the window and saw only the flickering TV, still droning on about storms rolling in from the north. She called her husband over. "Something's wrong," she said, her voice thin as tissue. When the police arrived, they found the front door ajar, as if whoever had come to collect the dead had left in too much of a hurry to close the nightmare behind him. The smell hit them first, a coppery sting clinging to the stale air and roasted meat gone rancid. One by one, officers in crisp uniforms who'd never dealt with more than petty thefts and drunk drivers stepped into the Thomas house and left parts of their innocence behind with every room they cleared. In the kitchen, the board game still lay scattered on the table, pieces frozen mid-play as if the family might come back any second to finish their last laugh. In the hallway, family portraits stared down at the officers. Richard's stern but gentle smile, Marjorie's soft eyes full of sacrifice, Emily's teenage grin half hidden behind a curtain of messy hair, Toby's gap-toothed mischief, immortalized in cheap Walmart frames. But the photos no longer matched the truth painted across the walls and floors in strokes no one could ever scrub clean. Emily didn't remember how she found the strength to walk out to them, bare feet leaving smudges on the linoleum she used to dance across when her parents fought too loud. She remembered a hand, cold, gloved, guiding her outside into the harsh morning light where the neighborhood had begun to gather, half curious, half horrified. Mrs. Klein let out a choked sob when she saw Emily wrapped in a police blanket too thin to shield her from the eyes that now pinned her like a butterfly on display. To the people of Sycamore Lane, the Thomas family was just like them, good, honest folks who paid their HOA fees on time, waved at church, brought potato salad to potlucks. But now they were a cautionary tale. A headline in waiting: Parents Dismembered in Gruesome July Family Massacre. The words would drip from the lips of local reporters who had to practice saying them without gagging. Emily didn't say a word that first day. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't ask for Toby, because she knew where Toby was. She knew what she had seen when she was dragged into the hallway, forced to watch as the man explained consequences the only way he knew how, with a blade that glinted like a promise that her nightmares would never end. The town changed overnight. It locked its doors tighter. Porch lights stayed on longer. Parents clutched their children's hands at the bus stop a little harder, whispers trailing behind them like cigarette smoke. Some neighbors crossed the street when they saw the Thomas house now, unable to look at the windows where the curtains had been ripped down during that final struggle, where Emily's shadow might still stand in the dark. The local pastor spoke softly about evil, not the abstract kind, but the kind that wears human skin and knocks on doors when the lights go out. He offered prayers, but behind his eyes flickered the same fear. If it could happen to the Thomases, it could happen to any of them. Reporters camped on lawns. They snapped photos of teddy bears and wilted flowers piling up by the mailbox, symbols of grief for people too polite to say out loud that they were glad it hadn't been their family, their house, their children. Emily watched them through the back window of her aunt's car the day she was driven away from the house where silence still screamed, away from the bedrooms that smelled of lavender and spilled secrets, away from the only place that had ever felt like home, even when it was broken. She thought about her father's laugh, the way it used to rumble through the walls when he'd have a beer with the neighbors. She thought about her mother's tired smile, how it lingered even when money was tight and arguments lingered, like mildew in the corners of their marriage. She thought about Toby, his toy trucks now rusting in Mrs. Klein's garden, waiting for little hands that would never pick them up again. The detectives asked her questions, gentle at first, then pointed, then gentle again when her silence became its own form of testimony. They wanted details. What did he look like? What did he say? How did he come in? Did your father know him? Did you know him? She answered when she could. But some truths lived only in the space between words, in the way her fingers dug into her sleeves, in the way she flinched when the door to the interview room creaked open. Her story painted the man as both shadow and storm, a debt collector, her father's brother-in-law's ghost from a past life no one in Sycamore Lane had dared to ask about. Money borrowed in desperation, promises made in whispers, consequences written in blood. The town wanted it to make sense. They needed to believe this was about money, about choices, about something that couldn't happen to them. But deep down, they all knew. Monsters don't need reasons. They need opportunities. And when doors open, they walk right in. Emily's new bed creaked under her at her aunt's house, 3 towns over, where the neighbors didn't know her name yet, where no one looked at her like she was a ghost wearing a teenage girl's face. She lay awake at night, eyes fixed on the ceiling fan spinning so slow she imagined it might stop altogether. She wondered if her father had really believed he could fix it that night. The money, the mistakes, the monster at the door. She wondered if her mother's last whispered prayers had been for forgiveness or for Emily to forget. But forgetting was never an option. Not when the past hung around her neck like a stone too heavy to slip off. The papers said family tragedy. The TV anchors said unspeakable horror. But for Emily, there were no headlines big enough to hold the weight of that silence. The town buried Richard and Marjorie Thomas on a drizzling Thursday. Closed caskets. No one asked about Toby out loud, but the priest's voice broke when he mentioned the youngest lost too soon. Emily stood by the graves, her aunt's arm a steel band around her shoulders. She listened to the wind whisper through the cemetery trees and wondered if her parents could hear her silent promise that she would not let this story end here, buried under cheap granite and wilted flowers. There were still pieces to pick up, secrets to unearth, promises to keep, even if she had to keep them alone. And so, while Sycamore Lane slowly swept the horror under its manicured lawns and polite chatter, Emily Thomas began to plan. Not for revenge, not yet, but for survival. Because surviving wasn't just about breathing. It was about remembering when everyone else wanted to forget. And somewhere in that dark tangle of grief and fury, a spark caught fire. A promise that this silence would not scream forever unanswered. Echoes in the walls, the secrets the house refused to bury. They boarded up the Thomas house before the summer was over. Plywood nailed over windows that once let in the sun now blocked out the curious stares of neighbors who could no longer bear to see the peeling paint and the rusted swing set swaying in an empty backyard. The town decided it was better that way. Better that the memories rot behind nailed doors than seep out into their perfect lawns and stain their white fences with questions no one wanted to answer. But while the house stood silent, its walls remembered everything. Emily Thomas, now sleeping under her aunt's floral quilts 3 towns away, dreamed about those walls more than she dreamed about her mother's soft lullabies or her father's rough carpenter's hands. In the quiet hours after midnight, she would lie in the dark and trace the grainy ceiling above her, replaying every creak of the floorboards, every hush of wind that slipped through the kitchen window on summer nights when the world still made sense. They said she was lucky to be alive, the only one left to tell the story no one really wanted to hear. But Emily knew that survival was not a gift, not when it chained you to a truth that rattled your bones every time you close your eyes. Her Aunt Margaret tried to make life feel normal again. She baked cookies that tasted of stale cinnamon and pity. She spoke in soft tones like Emily might shatter if she heard a voice too loud. At night, Margaret would knock gently on her door, asking if she needed anything, tea, water, warm milk. But all Emily needed were answers, and she knew Margaret didn't have them. They were back in the house, sealed behind police tape and plywood, in the floorboards that squeaked too loud when Toby crept for cookies, in the hidden crawlspace under the stairs where Richard Thomas once kept a rusted lockbox no one was supposed to find. Emily remembered that lockbox. She remembered the way her father's face tightened when she caught him crouched by the basement door late at night, stuffing papers back inside, as if they were snakes he couldn't let loose. He'd brushed her questions aside with a tired laugh and a promise. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Grown-up stuff." But Emily now understood that grown-up stuff was just secrets dressed up in words too heavy for a little girl to carry. Secrets that leaked through the cracks until the walls themselves whispered them in the dark. A week after the funeral, Emily sat cross-legged on the dusty floor of Margaret's attic, surrounded by boxes labeled Thomas Family, Miscellaneous. Old yearbooks, photo albums with curling edges, a stack of unsent Christmas cards with Marjorie's neat, looping handwriting forever frozen on their blank lines. But it wasn't the photos that caught Emily's eye. It was the letter. A single envelope tucked between pages of a school scrapbook she barely remembered making. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded, but the words cut through the years like fresh wounds. Richard, we can't keep this up. He's asking for more than we agreed to. I'm scared. I don't trust him anymore. We need to find a way out before it's too late. M. The handwriting was her mother's. The date, 2 years before the night's silence screamed. Emily read it once, twice. Each word felt like a match striking dry kindling in her chest. Her father's brother-in-law. The loan. The man at the door. But this letter, this quiet confession buried in a scrapbook of glitter and glue, hinted at more than unpaid debts. It hinted at a trap, at something darker than bad money. She stuffed the letter in her pocket, heartbeat pounding like footsteps in the hallway at midnight. Downstairs, Margaret called her for dinner, her voice a gentle melody that belonged to a world that believed children could just forget. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat and hid the letter beneath her shirt. She chewed Margaret's dry meat loaf with a smile she didn't feel and nodded when asked about school, about therapy, about sleep she never really got. That night, long after the lights went out, Emily flicked on the tiny flashlight sheet, stolen from the kitchen junk drawer, and unfolded her father's secrets under her blanket. What else was hidden in that house? What else did the boarded-up windows keep from the neighbors so eager to forget? Emily made a plan. She knew she'd go back, not today, not tomorrow, but soon. The police would tell her she shouldn't. The neighbors would whisper about the traumatized girl sneaking into the place, where her family's screams still hung in the air like cobwebs. But she didn't care. She needed to hear the house speak. She needed to peel back the plywood and the caution tape and listen to the echoes in the walls that refused to be buried under cheap news headlines and pitying casseroles dropped off by people who only stayed long enough to say, "Bless your heart," and then locked their doors twice that night. Days turned into weeks. The town's fear settled into routine. Sycamore Lane found other gossip to feed on. The Peterson boys' DUI, the mayor's rumored affair, the church bake sale scandal when someone stole petty cash from the donations jar. But beneath the buzz of polite chatter, the Thomas house sat like a blister no one could pop, waiting for someone to press too hard. On a cold Friday night in late September, when the streets were slick with early autumn rain and the smell of burning leaves drifted through the air like a ghost of summer's gone, Emily slipped out of her aunt's house. No one saw her climb the back fence. No one saw her duck under the sagging chain-link gate that still bore the police department's faded "Do Not Enter" tape. She stood in her old backyard, breath fogging in the chill, staring up at the boarded windows that looked back at her like blind eyes. She half expected to hear Toby's laughter echo off the swing set, to feel Marjorie's hand on her shoulder, telling her to come inside before she caught a cold. But all she heard was her own pulse, a thud-thud-thud in her ears that felt louder than any storm. The back door gave way with a gentle push, hinges sighing like they were tired of holding secrets shut. Inside, the smell hit her first, stale rot, old mildew, the ghost of a family dinner left to decay in a kitchen that would never again hum with warmth. Emily stepped over scattered game pieces, careful not to touch the stains that still marked the linoleum like shadows frozen in time. She moved through the hallway, past the family portraits that the police hadn't bothered to take, her father's grin now warped by moisture and neglect, her mother's eyes catching the weak beam of her flashlight like a question she would never answer. Emily found herself at the basement door. She remembered the lockbox. She remembered her father's hushed voice. Her fingers trembled as she turned the knob. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to come from the house itself. A warning, a welcome, a curse. She crept down the steps, each creak of the wood beneath her feet a heartbeat, counting down to whatever truth waited in the dark. At the bottom, the musty air pressed against her lungs, thick with the damp ache of secrets long kept. She shone her light across the shelves lined with paint cans and old tools. And there, tucked behind a stack of half-finished birdhouses, She saw it. The rusted lockbox, exactly where she remembered it. She dropped to her knees, fingers fumbling at the latch. It stuck at first, protesting with a squeal of rusted metal, then popped open with a snap that echoed through the basement like a gunshot. Inside, not money, not gold, not jewels. Papers, photographs, receipts for cash withdrawn in amounts too large for a carpenter's salary, letters written in her father's scrawl, promising to repay, begging for extensions, swearing loyalty to a name she recognized from whispered phone calls, a name the town never knew. And tucked between them all, a photograph that made her breath catch in her throat. Her father, arm around a man she knew only as the monster at their door, both grinning at a table littered with beer bottles and scattered bills. A brother-in-law? No, not just that. Partners, friends, betrayal in black and white. Emily clutched the photograph to her chest, the truth rattling through her bones like a storm that refused to pass. Her father hadn't just borrowed money. He had helped build the monster that came to destroy them. And in that basement, where the silence still screamed, Emily Thomas realized that her family's massacre hadn't begun with a knock on the door that July night. It had begun here, years ago, in secrets buried behind plywood and polite lies. And now, she was the only one left to dig them up. The girl who wouldn't forget, a daughter's hunt for the unspoken truth. Emily didn't sleep the night she found the lockbox. She didn't cry, didn't tremble, didn't allow the cold dampness of that basement to freeze her to the spot the way fear always had before. She sat there on the cracked concrete floor, her father's secrets spread out before her like a puzzle dumped from a box, each piece sharper than the last. Her father's face in that faded photograph haunted her in a way the memory of his final night never had, because this was a truth she'd never been allowed to see. The man she'd worshipped as strong and good and decent, laughing shoulder to shoulder with the monster who knocked when the lights went out. The betrayal tasted worse than the smell of mildew that clung to her clothes as she crept back up those basement stairs, paper stuffed under her coat, flashlight clutched like a dagger she wished she could stab through time. Outside, the wind rattled the loose plywood on the windows as if the house itself was begging her to come back, to stay, to finish listening to all the secrets it had hidden for too long. But Emily knew she couldn't stay. Not yet. She slipped through the back fence before dawn, her shoes caked in mud, her hands raw from gripping that lockbox so tight her nails had dug half-moons into her palms. Back in her Aunt Margaret's house, she buried the papers in a shoebox under her bed, layering them beneath old homework and clothes she never wore. She lay awake until morning, eyes wide, brain alive with questions the police hadn't asked, that no one had asked, because no one had wanted to know what could twist an ordinary family dinner into a horror story splashed across every local headline. Margaret's knock came soft as always. "Em, you awake, honey?" But Emily pretended to sleep, because how could she tell Margaret the truth when the truth would crack open the gentle lie that they were safe now, far from Sycamore Lane? At school, teachers looked at her like she was a ghost. Kids whispered behind her back in the cafeteria, their curiosity flickering for a moment before their fear took over. What if whatever came for the Thomases came for them too? But none of them knew that Emily carried the real monster in her backpack, not some faceless killer, but a paper trail that revealed her father's secret debts, shady deals, and the crooked brotherhood he'd sworn himself to when the bills piled too high and pride choked his options down to one desperate promise at a bar table. Emily watched her classmates complain about curfews and broken phones and heartbreaks that would heal by next week, and she felt a cold anger coil tight in her gut. They didn't know what it meant to lie awake listening for footsteps that might never come, to replay a single knock at the door until it became your heartbeat. So she stopped talking. She stopped flinching when they stared. She focused on what the papers told her. She read every line until her eyes burned. She memorized names she'd never heard spoken aloud at the dinner table. She mapped a network of favors and threats and debts that stretched far beyond Sycamore Lane. Crooked contractors, hush money, men who loaned cash with smiles sharp as switchblades. Her father wasn't the only man in town who owed. He was just the first to be made an example of. Emily's hands trembled every time she pulled a new clue from that shoebox at night. The pages spread across her bedroom floor like an evidence board only she could read. She found a name that kept appearing, a name that made the hair on her arms stand on end when she whispered it in the dark. Vincent Rourke. A man the papers hadn't printed, a man the police hadn't asked her about. But in every letter, every IOU, every frantic note her father had scrawled in shaky penmanship, there it was. V. Rourke says I need more time. Rourke wants the rest by Friday. If Rourke finds out, we're done. Who was Vincent Rourke? The question rooted itself in Emily's mind like a splinter she couldn't dig out. The local library's ancient computers told her little. Old clippings about a small-time construction boss fined for tax fraud. A rumor of extortion whispered but never proven. A shadow that seemed to slide out of every picture taken near city contracts. No one looked at too closely. If the monster who came to their door was the blade, Vincent Rourke was the hand that wielded it. Emily knew this truth before she ever saw him, because deep down she'd started to understand what monsters looked like when they wore human skin. One afternoon, when Margaret thought she was at her art therapy session, Emily stood outside a gray office building downtown. She pressed her forehead to the cold glass, watching the back of a man's head in a smoky office where blinds never lifted. She imagined him laughing at her father's desperate voice on the phone, at her mother's letters, at the life he'd helped unravel with a single knock at the door. She didn't go inside. Not then. Not yet. Instead, she watched, memorized his walk, the tilt of his head, the way men stepped aside when he barked an order. She told herself she was gathering courage, but the truth was bigger than courage. It was rage. Quiet rage that whispered, do it right. Do it smart. Don't become another scream behind a boarded window. So Emily waited. She collected scraps, rumors from janitors, sweeping the lobby at night, receipts from dumpsters, overheard gossip from secretaries who had no idea the quiet girl in the lobby doodling in her sketchbook was piecing together their whispered fears. Each clue twisted the knife deeper. Her father's debts weren't random. They were part of a pipeline, a bleeding artery that fed Rourke's empire of fear, a network that forced men to sign IOUs in bars while wives scrubbed children's clothes clean of mud and worry. When they couldn't pay, they paid in other ways, in favors, in secrets, in silence. And when silence wasn't enough, men like the stranger who knocked on the Thomas door came to collect what money never could. But Emily wasn't silent. Not anymore. She began writing it all down, line after line in a cheap spiral notebook she kept hidden under the loose floorboard in her room. Dates, names, dollar amounts. Every night, she wrote more until her hands cramped and her vision blurred, the same question echoing in her head like a heartbeat. Why us? Why them? Why now? The answer coiled in the edges of her father's letters. Because he tried to leave. Because in the final months before that July night, Richard Thomas had done something unthinkable. He'd threatened to go to the police. He'd found just enough hope to think he could break free of Rourke's grip, that he could buy his family a clean slate at the cost of the truth. But you can't blackmail the devil with a threat he's heard 100 times. You can't bargain with a man who owns the blade pressed to your throat. Emily read those words, traced her father's final desperate signature across a confession never sent, a plea for witness protection never filed. Her mother had begged him to run, the letter said so. But her father stayed, probably telling himself he could protect them if he just handled it himself. Now Emily was left with the wreckage of that lie, the only Thomas left to tell the truth. And she knew the truth was bigger than any single death. It was a story her town wanted to bury, her father's old friends wanted to forget, the police wanted off their desks because it was easier to call it a family tragedy than to follow the blood trail all the way back to Vincent Rourke's polished office door. But Emily wasn't interested in easy. She was interested in justice. She was interested in making the silence scream, so loud the town would never be able to sleep through it again. And she promised herself one cold October night, her breath fogging up her window as she watched cars drift by like ghosts under streetlights. She would not stop. She would not be quiet. She would not bury the echoes that the boarded-up house refused to let die. Because she wasn't just a victim. She was the daughter of the man who thought he could bargain with monsters. And now, she was the girl who wouldn't forget. When the silence screamed back, the night Emily broke the cycle. The air felt heavier that night, a sticky November chill that clung to Emily's hair as she waited across the street from Vincent Rourke's gray office building, the same one she'd circled so many nights before. The yellow street light above her flickered and buzzed like a warning. "Don't do it, Emily. Don't open this door." But she ignored it, just as she'd ignored Margaret's soft voice at dinner, the worried questions that piled up every time Emily disappeared for hours and came back with mud on her shoes and shadows in her eyes. For weeks, she played the part, the quiet survivor, the tragic orphan, the broken girl who stared blankly at teachers and counselors and polite neighbors who dared not ask what she did when they looked away. They didn't see the notebooks hidden under her floorboard, the notes folded into the lining of her backpack, the voice memos on her cheap second-hand phone recording every slip of gossip she caught from janitors, receptionists, barbacks, crumbs that led her here tonight. She knew Rourke would be alone. Friday nights were for handshakes at a backroom bar on Miller Avenue, a place where debts were arranged, not in paper but in flesh and fear. But tonight was different. He'd be here late, finalizing something big, she'd heard. Something that would shut down any whispers about the Thomas family once and for all. Emily's fingers tightened around the cold steel of the small recorder in her pocket, an old thing she'd bought with leftover birthday money. A cheap weapon, but the only one she could trust. She replayed her father's voice in her mind, that desperate promise he'd left scribbled in shaky pen on his last and signed confession. "I'll fix this. I swear I'll fix this. No one will touch them again." He'd meant it, but his mistake had been believing he could fix a monster without first dragging it into the light. Emily wouldn't make that mistake. She slipped from the shadows when Rourke's car turned into the alley behind the building, black SUV. Windows tinted, tires crunching on wet gravel. She ducked behind a dumpster, breath locked tight in her throat as his boots hit the ground. Heavy, casual, the walk of a man so used to fear that he didn't notice the quiet anymore. The back door creaked open, swallowed him, snapped shut. Emily counted to 50. Her legs moved before her fear could stop them. She crossed the alley, tested the knob. Unlocked, of course it was. Monsters feel safe behind doors everyone's too scared to knock on. Inside, the air smelled like stale cigars and aftershave, the same stench that had clung to the edges of her father's letters, that bitter undertone of men who thought money made them untouchable. She crept down the corridor, heart pounding so loud she was certain he'd hear it before she reached the door to his office. Voices drifted out, low, rough, a conversation not meant for eavesdropping ears. She pressed herself to the wall, breath shallow, recorder tucked in her palm. "The Thomas girl? You sure she's quiet?" A voice asked, not Rourke's. Another man, another debt collector. "She's just a kid. She doesn't know anything that matters." Rourke's voice snapped back, cold as a winter draft through a broken window. Emily's nails bit into her palm. She doesn't know anything that matters. But she did, more than they could imagine. She knew the names, the money trails, the bodies that never made it to the evening news. She knew what they'd done to her mother in that final moment when the lights went out. She knew the truth they'd buried in her father's silence. And tonight, she'd make sure the whole world knew too. She shifted closer, enough to see the faint glow under the office door. Her finger hovered over the recorder's switch. She forced herself to breathe, in, out, in, out. Margaret's face flashed in her mind, terrified, exhausted. The face of a woman who'd buried her baby sister and taken in a niece, who woke up screaming some nights and didn't wake up at all other nights because sleep was safer than remembering. Do it for her too, Emily thought. Do it for Toby. For Mom. For Dad. Flawed and foolish, but never cruel. The door cracked open, and she flinched back into the shadow just as the second man stepped out, muttering about a phone call. He didn't see her. The hall was empty, just her and Rourke's soft hum of satisfaction as he shuffled papers behind his desk. Emily slipped inside before she could think better of it. Rourke looked up. Surprise flickered across his face, then annoyance, then a smile so smooth it made her stomach twist. "Well, the little ghost shows up," he drawled. "I thought you'd run off for good." Emily said nothing. She stepped closer. His eyes flicked to the recorder in her hand, then back to her face. A slow grin spread, like a snake uncurling. "Looking to be a hero, huh?" or a martyr. Your old man tried that too. Look where it got him. He leaned back in his leather chair, confident, casual. A flick of his wrist, the unspoken threat of man outside ready to step back in with the same blade that carved her family apart. You think you scare me? Emily's voice cracked, but the words tasted like steel on her tongue. I know what you did. I have everything. The letters, the money, the people you paid off. It ends tonight. Rourke laughed, a low, hollow bark that bounced off the ugly wood-paneled walls. You think they'll listen to a kid? You think anyone cares? Your father cared. That's why he's fertilizer now. You're a headline that faded last month. No one remembers your screams anymore, sweetheart. Emily stepped closer, close enough to see the tiny vein throbbing in his neck. Then I'll make them remember. Her thumb clicked the recorder on. A tiny beep that cut through the stale cigar air like a gunshot. Rourke's grin vanished. He lurched forward, hand snatching at the edge of his desk. Emily saw the drawer half open, the gleam of a gun handle just visible under the paperwork. The final answer for anyone who asked questions too loud. But she moved first, not with violence, but with something sharper, the truth. She slammed the papers onto his desk, the photograph of her father with him, the receipts, the signed letters with Rourke's initials, all copied a dozen times and ready to scatter like seeds she'd plant in every newspaper, every inbox, every police file that still had a shred of decency left. It's over, she said, voice shaking but steady enough to stand on. Even if you kill me, it's over. Everyone will know. You can't board up my silence. Rourke's eyes darted to the door. His backup was taking too long. He lunged, hand outstretched. But Emily stepped back, recorder clutched tight. In that moment she felt her father's ghost at her shoulder. Not the man who'd lied and begged and failed, but the man who'd died trying to protect her when his own fear finally caved. And she felt her mother too. The hush of a whispered prayer unfinished, but never unheard. When the door slammed open behind her, when rough hands grabbed her shoulders, when Rourke's roar filled the tiny office, like a beast cornered at last, Emily did not scream. The silence did it for her. The recorder fell to the floor, skittered under the desk. But its tiny red light kept blinking. Outside, tires squealed. Headlights cut through the alley. Sirens, faint at first, then louder closer. Because Emily hadn't come alone. Her last message sent. Her story attached. The final words of the girl who refused to forget forwarded to every reporter who'd ever called her a victim. The building's hallway erupted with shouts. Confused men in cheap suits scrambling for exits that wouldn't save them tonight. And in that chaos, Emily felt something strange and bright unfurl in her chest. Not hope, not quite freedom, but the raw beginning of something that tasted like justice. They would bury this story if they could, call it a tragic end for a tragic girl. But she'd made sure it wouldn't die behind boarded windows this time. The Thomas family screams would echo, in headlines, in courtrooms. In the hush that came over Sycamore Lane every time someone drove past that peeling house and wondered how silence could scream so loud and so long. And Emily, bruised but unbroken, the last survivor of a supper that ended in darkness, knew this. Monsters only win when we stop dragging them into the light. So she would keep dragging. She would keep speaking. She would not forget. And neither would they. Not now, not ever again.